3 weeks after she had last put a candle in the window for a traveler, one arrived. The White Anchor Inn stood at the lower edge of Carbridge Village, in the northernmost reach of Inverness-shire, where the road from the high pass descended into the valley, and the October wind found every gap in the stone. It was not a fine establishment. It had never pretended to be. The sign above the door had been repainted twice in the last decade, the second time by Rosalind herself, with paint purchased from a draper's cart, and the two best rooms, the ones with plaster ceilings and serviceable mattresses, were on the eastern side, where the morning light came first, and the cold came second. Rosalind Hartwell knew every inch of the building the way a surgeon knows a patient he has kept alive through difficult seasons. She knew which stair creaked under the third step. She knew that the left-hand window in the parlor let in weather if the latch was not set at precisely the right angle. She knew that the kitchen fire would draw poorly until November, when the temperature differential finally gave it something to work with. And at the edge of all that October darkness, having just set her accounts ledger aside to light the last lamp above the door, was Rosalind. She saw the figure coming down the road before she heard him. He was on foot, which was unusual for a man in a tailcoat, and the tailcoat, even in the poor light, was not the kind worn by merchants or schoolmasters. It was cut too well. He was moving carefully, not injured, she decided, but exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been managing a crisis for several days without rest. He had no bag, no horse, no companion. He had, as she would confirm within the next 90 seconds, no coin. He stopped at the door. He looked at the sign, then at her, with the steady attention of a man who does not waste effort on social performance. "I can offer nothing tonight," he said. "My horse went lame 4 miles back. My bag went with a dishonest carter at the crossroads this morning. I have no coin and no means of sending for any until I reach Inverness, which I cannot do until tomorrow." He paused. "I am not asking for charity. I am stating the situation precisely so that you may close the door if you choose." Rosalind looked at him for a moment. He was tall and dark-coated, and said exactly what he meant, which was already more than she got from most travelers. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "Supper is finished, but there is bread and broth. The east room is available. You may settle the account when you are able." He looked at her with the particular stillness of a man who had not expected this answer and was recalculating. "You do not know who I am," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I know what a man looks like when he has been keeping himself upright through sheer arrangement of will, and it seems a poor use of a serviceable room to leave it empty." He came inside. She did not ask his name that night, and he did not offer it. She gave him bread, broth, a candle, and the east room, and she returned to her accounts without making anything of it. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. Rosalind Hartwell had been running the White Anchor Inn for 11 years. She had been doing the real work of it for 14. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had acquired the inn in 1803 from a debt-encumbered cousin who was glad to be quit of it. He had acquired it, that is, in the formal sense. His name went on the lease, his name appeared in the account books, and his name was the one the village used when they spoke of the White Anchor. Thomas Hartwell was a man of warm intentions and very little operational capacity, and he had understood almost immediately after taking possession that the inn required more than warm intentions. It required someone who could negotiate with suppliers, manage a staff of 3, maintain the building's structural needs, extend appropriate credit to known customers, decline credit to unknown ones, and do the accounts at the end of every month with enough accuracy to satisfy the landlord and enough creativity to satisfy the actual state of the margin. He had looked at his household and identified the person capable of this work. Rosalind had been 17. She had been, at that point, in the 3rd year of the education her mother had spent careful money on: reading, arithmetic, a modest French, the accounts and correspondence that a clergyman's daughter might reasonably be expected to manage in a well-run household. She had been preparing, in other words, for a different kind of life. She had put that preparation to a different use. By the time she was 20, she had renegotiated the inn's supplier agreements with 4 separate merchants, reduced the monthly outgoing by 11 shillings, and identified a structural problem with the east wall that, if left unaddressed, would have cost 3 times the price of its repair within 2 years. She had managed this not through charm or connection, but through the simple application of clear thinking to specific problems, which is not a quality anyone thought to credit to a girl of 20, managing her father's inn in a northern market town. By the time she was 26, her father had died, and the lease had passed, by the arrangement of a solicitor who had done his best within the constraints of what the law allowed, to a cousin named Gerald, who lived in Edinburgh and had no intention of managing the inn himself. Gerald was not a cruel man. He was merely a man who considered Rosalind's presence at the White Anchor as a form of labor he was fortunate to receive without cost, and who sent, every quarter, a letter inquiring after the accounts and a list of improvements he was considering, none of which he ever funded. Rosalind had managed Gerald the way she managed the kitchen fire in summer, with patience and the knowledge that his primary quality was an absence of active interference. She sent him quarterly reports, kept his name on the correspondence, and ran the inn as though it were hers, because in every meaningful operational sense it was. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had been doing it for 14 years when the man in the well-cut tailcoat came down from the pass with no coin and no horse. She was 31. She had managed creditors, seasonal floods, a disputed tenancy claim involving the stable yard, 2 hiring mistakes she had corrected without drama, and one summer when the main road was rerouted that had reduced traffic to such a degree that she had spent 3 months working through the margin, the way a carpenter works through a diminished store of lumber, with care, with calculation, and without panic. She had considered in the abstract what her future looked like. The inn was secure as long as Gerald remained uninterested and the landlord was satisfied. She was skilled enough to have taken a position in household management had she chosen to seek one, but the inn was her work, and she was not inclined to diminish it by calling it something lesser than it was. There had been one moment, when she was 22, when an older man, a retired factor who had stopped at the inn for 2 nights and observed her at work, had told her plainly that he had never seen a woman her age who understood a ledger with that precision, and that he meant it as the highest form of compliment he knew how to give. She had thanked him. She had returned to her accounts. She had pressed one hand briefly against the wall of the corridor after he left, not from sentiment, but from the understanding that acknowledgment, when it came, was a thing to register quietly and then continue without. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but she had understood by then that the world was not in the habit of making space for her to step into. The stranger occupied the east room for 3 days. On the first morning, Rosalind brought breakfast without comment and noted that he had slept in his clothes, that he had the specific stillness of a man who had been making decisions under pressure and was, temporarily, without a decision to make. He thanked her in the formal manner of someone for whom courtesy is a habit too deeply set to suspend even in exhaustion. On the second morning, he was downstairs before her. She found him in the kitchen, not touching anything, standing at the window that looked toward the northern road with the focused attention of a man waiting for something specific. "You are expecting someone," she said, not as a question. "My man of business," he said. "I sent word yesterday from the village. He should arrive by noon." He did. The man of business, a small, efficient person named Calder, arrived at 11:30 on a hired horse, carrying a saddlebag. The exchange between them was brief and conducted in the parlor with the door closed, and Rosalind respected both the privacy and the reasonable inference that whatever was being transferred in that saddlebag It was enough to settle any account she might be owed. The stranger came to find her in the accounts room afterward. He set coins on the desk beside her ledger, not the modest amount she might have asked, but a sum that reflected a considered understanding of what 3 days' hospitality had cost, plus something more. "This is more than the room," she said. "It accounts for the room, the meals, the credit extended without conditions, and the stable space for a horse that doesn't exist," he said. "The last item is a courtesy for the absence of one." She looked at him then, fully, for the first time, in the daylight of the accounts room. He was perhaps 10 years older than she was. The lines at the corners of his eyes were not from sun, but from the kind of sustained, focused attention that is its own weather. He was watching her with an expression she did not immediately recognize because she had not encountered it in some time. It was not assessment exactly. It was closer to the careful attention of someone who has found a thing they did not know they were looking for, and is now trying to understand what it is. "I am Charles Ashworth," he said. "I should have said so on the first night." "You were in no condition for introductions on the first night," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the approach of one. "No," he said. "I was not." He paused. "I will be returning through this road in approximately 3 weeks. I would like to stop here. The East Room will be available," she said. He left that afternoon. She returned to her ledger, entered the sum with precision, and sat for a moment looking at the page. It was not elation, not hope, but something older and quieter than either. The particular recognition of a person who has managed alone for a long time and has just, briefly, been seen by someone who appeared to be looking with the full faculty of his attention. Then she picked up her list and continued. Charles Ashworth, 8th Duke of Inverin, had ridden north to inspect the Glennock estate because 3 years of bad management had left it in a condition he had been warned about by his factor and had preferred, until now, to address through correspondence. He had addressed it through correspondence because the estate in question had been his mother's family home, and his mother had been dead for 9 years, and he had found in the intervening time that proximity to the things she had loved required a specific kind of preparation he was still not entirely able to produce on demand. He had finally produced it, or something close enough to serve, in the autumn of this year. He had ridden north in October. His horse had gone lame in the high pass, and his bag had gone with a dishonest carter. That part was true and unremarkable, and he had come down into the valley in the dark and found, at the edge of it, an inn with a lamp above the door, and a woman standing in the light of it who had looked at him and asked for nothing. He had not, in 9 years of managing the dukedom, met anyone who asked for nothing. Calder, when he arrived on the second day and heard the account, had made a quiet note in the manner of a man who files information without comment. Calder had been his secretary for 6 years, and had developed the professional discretion of someone who has learned that the Duke's private observations are worth attending to, even when, especially when, they are delivered without explanation. What Charles had told Calder was this: the woman who ran the White Anchor Inn had offered credit without conditions to a stranger who had arrived with nothing, had managed the situation with the specific efficiency of someone to whom crises are ordinary, and had done the accounts of a working establishment with a precision that he had observed, briefly and without her knowledge, through the half-open door of the accounts room on the second morning. What he had not told Calder was what he had seen in that ledger: the clean columns, the marginal notations, the correction of a supplier error caught in the quarterly reconciliation that suggested not merely competence, but the exact kind of systematic attention that the Glennock estate had been missing for the better part of a decade. He had stood outside that half-open door for 4 minutes. Then he had gone to the window to wait for Calder. He had thought about it on the road south. He had thought about it at Inverin. where the house was large and well managed and inhabited by himself and a staff who were loyal and professionally correct, and offered him, collectively, the quality of a well-maintained mechanism that runs without friction but generates no warmth. He had thought about it in the library, sitting with the Glennack estate accounts, which were in a condition that would have caused Rosalind Hartwell to straighten her spine and pick up a pen, and recognized that what he was actually thinking about was not the Glennack accounts. He had made a decision. He was not, in general, a man who made decisions impulsively, and he did not consider this one impulsive. He had observed enough in 3 days to know the quality of what he had encountered. The rest would require proximity, and proximity required a reason, and he had the estate to provide one. He returned to Carbridge in 3 weeks, as he had said he would. He arrived in the afternoon this time, on a sound horse, and he came into the White Anchor through the front door the way a man comes through a door he expects to enter again. Rosalind was at the front desk, not the accounts room, and she looked up when he entered with the attention of someone who had, in the intervening 3 weeks, neither expected nor dismissed the possibility of his return. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, and then stopped, because Calder, who had come in directly behind him, addressed her as Miss Hartwell, and followed it with "Your Grace," directed at Charles, and the geometry of the room rearranged itself. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the register. "The East Room is available," she said, in precisely the same tone she had used 3 weeks ago, and made the entry. It was, Charles thought, almost certainly the least impressed response to a ducal title he had ever received. He stayed for 10 days. It was ostensibly connected to the Glennack estate, and there were meetings with the local factor, an inspection of the property, 3 mornings spent going through accounts that he brought, with Calder's assistance, to the table in the White Anchor's parlor. But the meetings with the factor were completed by the 4th day, and he continued to occupy the East Room for the remaining 6. He began to understand, across those 10 days, the architecture of what Rosalind Hartwell had built. It was not merely the inn. It was the web of small arrangements that held the inn in the community. The extended credit to the schoolmaster's family in January, the reduced rate for the midwife who kept irregular hours, the exact judgment about which suppliers were reliable enough to pay promptly, and which required a reserve of 3 weeks before settlement. These were not decisions made by a woman who was merely managing someone else's establishment. They were the decisions of someone who had understood, over 14 years, that an inn in a northern village is a kind of infrastructure, and had managed it accordingly. He observed this the way he observed most things, quietly, through attention rather than inquiry. He did not ask her to explain her methods. He watched her work. On the 5th evening he made a mistake. He had left his Glennack accounts on the parlor table while he went upstairs for his coat, and when he returned, Rosalind was standing at the table not looking at the accounts but at a letter that had been placed on top of them, a letter from the Glennack factor containing a figure that was, even to a layman's eye, notably inconsistent with the accounts below it. She stepped back when he came in. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I came to clear the table. The letter was open." "The figure concerned you," he said. It was not a question. A pause. "The quarterly tenancy receipts in the accounts are £640. The figure in the factor's letter is 510. The discrepancy is either an error in one of the 2 documents or something else." "Something else," he said. She looked at him directly. "How long?" "We believe 3 years. She picked up the accounts ledger from the table and handed it to him without a word. He took it. Their hands did not touch. She had already moved to clear the other end of the table, and he stood for a moment with the ledger in his hands and the specific understanding that the woman clearing his table had identified, in 90 seconds of accidental observation, what his Edinburgh solicitors had spent 6 months failing to confirm. "Miss Hartwell," he said. She turned. I have a proposal, not, he paused, precisely, of the kind one might assume. A professional one. I need someone to go through the Glenach accounts from the beginning. 3 years of them. I need someone who will not be confused by deliberate complexity, and who will not be managed by a factor who has had a great deal of practice managing people. She was very still for a moment. I run an inn, she said. You run an inn the way an engineer runs a bridge, he said. It holds because you understand the load it's carrying and where the strain is likely to come from. She did not answer immediately. She set down the cloth she was holding and stood straight and looked at him with the expression of someone doing a real calculation. Not about the work, which she had already assessed and filed in the competence column, but about something larger and less charted than the Glenach accounts. I would need someone to manage the inn in my absence, she said at last. That can be arranged. I would need access to every document, not a selection. You will have it. And the factor is not to be informed of the specific nature of the review until it is complete. Agreed. Another pause. Then I will come to Glenach, she said, and I will find what there is to find. She said it the way she said most things, simply, without performance. But he saw her press one hand briefly against the edge of the table before she turned away, and he understood that she was registering something, the way she had registered things before, without display, but not without feeling. Rosalind arrived at Glenach House 11 days later, on a Tuesday in November, with a leather satchel containing her own account notation system, 3 sharpened pencils, and a small personal reserve of currency that she had put aside from the inn's margin over the previous year, which she kept not from paranoia, but from the habit of a woman who has understood from an early age that the ability to leave is a form of safety. The house was large and cold and had the specific quality of a building that had once been animated by a particular person's attention and has not quite recovered from the absence. She felt it the moment she stepped inside, not grief exactly, but the echo of it in the arrangement of rooms, the way the morning light hit the hall, the particular silence of a house that is maintained but not inhabited in the full sense. The housekeeper, a woman named Agnes Birch, met her at the door. Agnes was 50, direct, and clearly in the process of deciding what to make of the woman the Duke had sent from Carbridge with authority to review the estate accounts. Her decision came quickly. "Come away in," Agnes said. "You'll want the morning room for the work. It has the best light and the warmest fire." It was not effusive welcome. It was practical welcome, which was better. The first person to offer Rosalind anything resembling friendship at Glenach was a woman named Eleanor Shaw, who arrived 3 days after Rosalind and was there to stay with her cousin, who was one of the neighboring estate wives. Eleanor was 28 and had the direct quality of someone who has decided that life is too short for social choreography. She appeared in the morning room doorway on her second day, observed Rosalind working through a stack of ledger volumes, and said, "You look like you've found something." "I've found several things," Rosalind said. "Is it bad?" "It is systematic," Rosalind said, which was the precise answer, and Eleanor looked at her with the expression of someone who has just encountered a person she is going to respect. Eleanor sat down. She was not there to help with the accounts. She had no training for it. But she was there in the way that a person is there when they have decided to witness something, and her presence over the following week was, in its own way, a form of support that Rosalind had not known she needed and received without making too much of it. What Rosalind found in the Glenach accounts was this: over 37 months, the factor, a man named Drummond, who had managed Glenach since before the late Duchess's death, had been recording tenancy receipts at figures slightly below actual collection, keeping the difference, and covering the discrepancy through a combination of supplier padding and a quarterly adjustment entry that was labeled, with remarkable consistency, as Maintenance and Improvement Reserve, which reserve never appeared in any corresponding expenditure record. The total discrepancy across 37 months was £2,460. Rosalind had it confirmed by the 4th day. By the 6th day, she had annotated every relevant entry in 3 separate ledger volumes, cross-referenced it to the actual tenancy rolls that Drummond had filed separately and apparently expected no one to compare, and prepared a summary document of 11 pages that laid the mechanism out from beginning to end. It was the kind of work that required not brilliance but patience, and the refusal to be satisfied by a partial explanation, and she had done it in 6 days because she had spent 14 years developing exactly that quality. Charles came to the morning room on the 6th evening. He had been in and out of Glenach for the previous 3 days. There was business in Inverness, and then he had returned, and he had asked no questions about her progress, which she had noted as a form of respect. He came in now and sat down across the table from her, and she turned the summary document and placed it in front of him. He read it. He read all 11 pages, which took 18 minutes, during which time she returned to her pencil and continued with the cross-referencing, because the work was not finished, simply because the evidence was documented. When he finished, he set the document down. 24 months more, he said, and he might have covered it entirely through the reserve entries. 20 months, she corrected. The error in his supplier padding was compounding. By the 33rd month, it would have become visible in the standard audit. He looked at her across the table. There was a fire behind her, and the window was dark and the room was very quiet. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "you have just recovered the better part of my mother's estate from a man who has been taking from it for 3 years. I have documented what he has taken," she said. "Recovery is a matter for your solicitors." "Yes," he said, but he continued to look at her in that way, the careful, full faculty way he had looked at her in the accounts room in Carbridge, the first time she had understood that he was looking at her and not at the situation she represented. She picked up her pencil and returned to the ledger. He did not leave the morning room. He sat across from her for another hour while she worked, not speaking but present, in the way that a person is present when they have decided they do not want to be anywhere else. It was not uncomfortable. It was the most comfortable she had felt in a room with another person in more years than she could accurately count. At 9 o'clock she set her pencil down. "Your cravat has been incorrectly knotted since you came in," she said. "The left side is lower than the right." He looked at her. "It has been that way for 40 minutes, she added, with the precision of someone reporting a ledger discrepancy. "I did not say anything because you were reading." There was a moment, a quiet, specific moment, and then he reached up and straightened the cravat, and the faint approach of a smile that she had seen once before in the accounts room in Carbridge came back to his face and settled there. "You could have said something at the beginning," he said. "You were reading," she said again, as though this were entirely sufficient, which it was. He had known, since somewhere around the 4th day at the White Anchor, that his visit to Carbridge was not entirely explained by the Glenach estate. He had not been ready to name this to himself with precision until he was sitting in the morning room at 9 in the evening, watching Rosalind Hartwell annotate a ledger by firelight, and even then he named it the way he named most things, without fanfare, and with the full understanding that naming a thing changed the obligation to act on it. He had a duty to make no rash decisions. He also had a very clear picture, assembled from 64 days of observation and 18 minutes of reading, of what this woman had built and survived and decided and refused. And the picture had the quality of something solid and load-bearing, like a well-built bridge that has been standing in weather for years without acknowledgement. There was also the question of opposition. Lady Cavendish, Harriet Cavendish, 24, daughter of the Earl of Dalmeny, had been considered by every relevant social mechanism the obvious candidate for the Duchess of Inverness since the preceding season. She was well connected, well presented, and had made no errors. Her family had made inquiries. His solicitors had received, in an oblique way, a communication suggesting that the Earl of Dalmeny would welcome a conversation. Charles had not initiated that conversation, but he had not foreclosed it, and the social machinery had continued to operate in the way social machinery does when it is not explicitly stopped. Harriet Cavendish arrived at Glennock 12 days after Rosalind, in a traveling carriage with a maid and 2 footmen, and the specific composure of a woman who has prepared for an introduction that she expects to proceed in a predetermined direction. She was intelligent enough, within 20 minutes of arriving, to understand that the direction was not predetermined. The woman in the morning room with the ledgers was not a secretary. She was not a servant. She was something the social vocabulary of 1819 did not have a precise word for. A woman doing skilled, consequential work in the home of a duke, with his explicit authorization and his evident respect. And the categoryless nature of it was, to Harriet Cavendish, more alarming than anything she could have named. She was gracious, she had good manners, and she used them as instruments. She said, at dinner on the second evening, in the pleasant tone of someone offering helpful information, "Miss Hartwell, I imagine the accounts work must be nearly concluded. It is remarkable that the Duke could find no one more professionally equipped to carry it out, but I suppose in a remote area one makes use of what is available." The table was quiet for a moment. Rosalind set down her fork with a neatness that was not a performance of composure but the actual thing. "The accounts work is substantially concluded," she said. "I have documented a misappropriation of £2,460 across 37 months, which will require your solicitor's attention." This last was addressed to Charles. "As for my professional qualifications, I have been managing the accounts and operations of a working establishment for 14 years, which I mention not by way of argument, but because it seems relevant to the question of equipment." She picked up her fork. Eleanor Shaw, across the table, looked at her glass of wine and said nothing, but the specific quality of her silence was one of profound satisfaction. Harriet Cavendish did not respond. She was not a stupid woman, and she had heard what was actually said. She returned to her dinner with the stillness of someone filing a recalibration. The estate's solicitor arrived from Edinburgh 3 days later, a man named Edward Forsyth who had served the Inveran dukedom for 22 years, and had the specific authority of someone who has earned both the trust and the caution of the person he serves. He was 60, precise, and had been briefed by Calder. He came into the morning room the way people came into rooms where Rosalind was working, with a look of prior expectation that adjusted, slightly, when he saw the reality. He reviewed her summary document for 30 minutes. He asked 4 questions. She answered all 4 with the exact page and ledger volume reference. He put the document down and looked at her in the way the retired factor had looked at her 9 years ago in Carbridge, except with more authority behind it. "This will hold," he said. "This will hold in a legal proceeding." "I know," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Miss Hartwell, you are aware that the standard fee for this type of investigative accounting work is not insubstantial." "I expect to discuss terms with His Grace," she said. "I recommend you do," Forsyth said, with the specific weight of a man who means more than he is saying. Charles's father arrived on a Thursday. Malcolm Ashworth, the Earl of Strathfell, Charles's father held the lesser title as his courtesy rank, was 71, upright, precise, and had traveled 3 days from Edinburgh because Calder's letter, which had been carefully written to convey the situation without explicitly conveying the situation, had been read correctly by a man who had been reading such letters for half a century. He came to Glennock and found his son in the library with a woman from Carbridge who had documented a 3-year fraud and appeared to have settled into the house with the self-possession of someone who has decided it is hers. Malcolm was not unkind. He was old and certain of the order of things, which is a different quality. He asked, on the first evening when Charles was briefly absent from the room, "How long have you been here, Miss Hartwell?" 3 weeks, she said. "And before that you were at the inn in Carbridge?" "Yes." "Running it?" "Yes." He looked at her with the measuring attention of an older generation who had not expected to find a woman of this quality in this location. "You are not," he said, "from a family of consequence." "No," she said. "My father was a tenant innkeeper of the second generation." "And your prospects?" "Are the inn," she said, without flinching, "which is a functioning establishment with a sound ledger and 11 years of stable operation. I don't diminish it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the newspaper he had put down and returned to it. He did not say anything further that evening. She picked up her own work and continued. She had managed harder conversations than this one before breakfast. She could manage this. The formal hearing to address the Drummond matter was held in Inverness on the first Tuesday of December, in a room at the offices of Forsyth and Company that had the particular gravity of a space where decisions with real consequences are made. The room held 8 people. Forsyth and his clerk, 2 representatives of the Crown's legal interest, Drummond himself with his own solicitor, Charles, Calder, and Rosalind. Drummond's solicitor had spent the previous week identifying every possible avenue of challenge. He had found 4. 2 of them were legitimate procedural objections. One was an attempt to characterize the account discrepancies as a notational system different from the standard, which was technically plausible until it ran into Rosalind's cross-referencing of the tenancy rolls. The 4th was a direct challenge to Rosalind's authority to conduct the review. She was not, his solicitor noted, a licensed accountant. She was the manager of an inn. Rosalind stood. She had brought everything with her: 3 annotated ledger volumes, the 11-page summary document, the tenancy roll comparison, which ran to 7 pages and included the specific dates of collection, the recorded amounts in Drummond's accounts, and the actual amounts confirmed by 6 of the 11 tenant farmers who had been contacted through Forsyth's office over the preceding 2 weeks. She had also brought a single sheet of her own making, a 1-page chart that mapped the compounding supplier padding against the quarterly reserve entries over 37 months, in a visual format that made the mechanism legible to anyone in the room who was not already familiar with double-column accounting. She placed the documents on the table. She did not argue. She did not respond to the challenge to her authority with anything except the demonstration of that authority, which is the only response worth making. "The discrepancy in the 3rd quarter accounts for 1817, she said, "is on page 44 of the 1st volume, annotated in red. The corresponding tenancy roll for the same quarter, which shows actual collections, is in the 2nd document, page 3. The 6 tenant confirmations from Forsyth's office are appended to the summary." She paused. "If it would assist the proceeding, I can take any entry in any of the 37 quarters and trace it through all 3 documents in under 4 minutes. I am ready to do so." The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment. Drummond's solicitor looked at the chart. He looked at the ledgers. He said something in a low voice to his client. Drummond had been a factor of 20 years' standing. He had been careful. He had been, by his own understanding, managing a remote estate in a way that would not attract the attention of absentee ownership. He had not counted on a woman from Carbridge who had been doing real accounts work since the age of 17, and who had the specific quality of being unable to let an unexplained discrepancy rest. He looked at Rosalind across the table with the expression of a man who recognizes that the thing he built has been dismantled and the pieces are all on the table. "I will cooperate with the settlement," his solicitor said, in a flat voice. Forsyth nodded once. He made a note. Charles, who had not spoken during the proceedings, stood. He had been watching Rosalind present the evidence with the attention he gave to things that mattered to him. Now he looked at the assembled room. Forsyth, the legal representatives, Drummond's solicitor, and said, in the measured tone of a man who does not make public statements carelessly, Miss Hartwell has provided the estate of Glennack with the most precise and complete accounting review it has received in a decade. The estate is in her debt. He turned to Rosalind. He did not kneel. They were in a legal office, not a ballroom, and he was not a theatrical man. But he took her hand, the bare hand she had extended to collect the annotated ledger volume, and he held it for a moment with the specific deliberateness of someone making a statement in a room full of witnesses. The room understood this before it had words for it. Forsyth looked at his papers with the expression of a man who has seen something and is choosing not to comment on it directly. Eleanor Shaw, who had insisted on attending, and was seated in the back corner with a composed expression that barely concealed her profound personal satisfaction, looked at her gloves. Malcolm Ashworth, who had come to Inverness and was standing in the doorway of the room, having arrived 20 minutes earlier than expected and having witnessed the last part of the proceeding, said nothing. He stood for a moment in the doorway, then he came in and sat down. Later, after the formalities were complete and the room had cleared, he came to stand beside Rosalind while she collected her documents, and he said, without looking at her directly, "The tenancy roll comparison. That was the piece that made it undeniable." "Yes," she said. "You saw it quickly. Discrepancies of that type compound if they are not addressed," she said. "The longer they run, the more entries they require to cover. At a certain point, the structure becomes too elaborate to sustain." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about several things," he said, with the specific flatness of a man who is not accustomed to saying this and has decided it must be said. "I will not enumerate them, but I was wrong." She looked at him directly, without softness and without hardness. "Thank you," she said, and meant it precisely. He nodded once and walked away. It was not warmth, it was recognition, offered late and imperfect, and it was, in its own terms, enough. The genuine proposal came on a Thursday evening in the library at Glennack, 3 days after the Inverness hearing. The fire was low and the room smelled of old paper and pine, and Rosalind was at the writing table making notes for Forsyth's office on the recovery process when Charles came in and did not pretend to have another reason for being there. "There was a public moment," he said, "in the hearing room. That was necessary for the estate record, and I do not regret it. But it was not the thing I wanted to say." She set down her pen. He remained standing. He was not performing anything. "I have been watching you work for 64 days, he said. "I have watched you make decisions I would not have thought to make, and then return to your list as though the decision cost you nothing, which is not true, but is the way you carry things. And I have watched you answer this house's problems the way you answered everything, with patience and the refusal to let an incomplete account rest." He paused. "I am not asking because you have been useful to the estate. I am not asking because it would be a convenient arrangement for either of us. I am asking because when I came down from the pass in October with nothing, and you stepped back from the doorway without requiring anything from me, I recognized something, and every day since has confirmed it." She was very still. This was not the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of someone doing a real and complete calculation before answering. The kind of calculation she applied to things that mattered. "You are a duke," she said. "Yes. The opposition to this will not be negligible. No, it will not. My father has said what he has to say. He will, in time, say something different. The social machinery will require management. Your cousin's claim on the inn will need legal address." He looked at her steadily. "I have considered all of this." "I know," she said, because she did. She had spent 64 days watching him think, and she knew what his thinking looked like when it was complete. Another pause. "Then I will need to arrange for the inn's management before I can leave Carbridge permanently. I know that as well. She looked at him for one more moment, the last moment of a calculation that had been running for longer than she was prepared to say, and then she said, "Yes." He crossed the room and took her hand, and this time the holding of it was not a statement for a room full of witnesses. It was private, and it was entirely his own. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and it had been enough, and she was going to stop being invisible now. They were married in the spring, in the church at Carbridge, in a ceremony attended by the village, all of it, because Rosalind Hartwell had extended credit and reduced rates and made the right decision about the midwife's account for 11 years, and the village turned out with the specific warmth of people acknowledging a debt they are glad to have the chance to mark. Eleanor Shaw stood beside her. Forsyth gave the legal documents his particular precision. Agnes Birch had come from Glenelg and spent the reception managing the supper arrangements with the efficiency of someone who has decided that any occasion worth celebrating is worth organizing correctly. Malcolm Ashworth attended and said nothing unnecessary and shook Charles's hand and bowed to Rosalind with a correctness that was not warmth but was, from that man, a form of final reckoning. She received it as she had received his acknowledgment in Inverness, precisely and without theater. Harriet Cavendish, who had returned to Edinburgh before the winter was out, was said to have found, by the following season, a match more suited to what she actually wanted, which was a husband she could manage in a more conventional direction. She was not destroyed, she was simply located in the place the story had always been moving her toward, which was elsewhere. The inn at Carbridge passed to a formal lease arrangement that Rosalind negotiated herself, with Forsyth's guidance, to remove Gerald's nominal authority and establish a managed tenancy under a capable couple from the village, the Forsters, who had worked in the inn's kitchen for 6 years and knew its particular operational requirements. Gerald accepted the terms without objection. He had never been to Carbridge and had no reason to start now. The Glenelg estate was formally returned to the ducal holdings, with the recovered funds applied to the tenancy infrastructure that Drummond's years of management had allowed to decay. Rosalind spent the first full year of her marriage overseeing the estate accounts, not as a task assigned to her by someone else, but as the natural extension of the work she had already done, now properly credited and properly compensated, with her name on the correspondence and her judgment recognized in the formal record. It was not a transformation, it was a correction. By the second year she had drafted a set of estate account practices, a methodology for quarterly reconciliation and supplier verification that Forsyth, who had seen a great many sets of estate accounts in 22 years, described as the clearest notation system he had encountered in his professional life. He asked, with the specificity of a man who knows the value of a thing, whether she would object to sharing the methodology with 2 other estates under his firm's management. She did not object. The notation spread, in the quiet way that useful things spread, without fanfare, through the simple force of being better than what existed before. Their daughter was born in the spring of the second year. She was named Margaret, after Charles's mother, by Rosalind's suggestion, which he received without words and with the full force of his attention, which she had come to understand was the way he received things that cost him something. Margaret arrived in the world with the specific efficiency of a person who had decided the arrangements were satisfactory and moved accordingly, and by 18 months she had determined that the kitchen corridor was the most interesting route between any 2 points in Glenelg, and could not be contained by standard domestic infrastructure. On a Tuesday morning in March, Rosalind was at the writing table in the morning room, her morning room now, and she knew every peculiarity of its light and its draft, working through the second quarter accounts while Margaret ran the length of the corridor outside, producing a sound that was either joy or an operational assessment of the flagstone acoustics. Both were possible. Charles was at the other table, reading correspondence, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of the fire and the particular quality of March light, as a constant, a presence that required no cataloging because it was simply there, and she was warmer for it. She looked up once and found him watching her. He had been watching her for a minute at least, with the full faculty attention she had first noticed in the accounts room in Carbridge, the night he had looked at her like a man identifying something he did not yet understand. He understood it now. She had understood it for some time. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and returned to the accounts, because the second quarter would not reconcile itself, and she was not the person who left things incomplete. Outside, Margaret had discovered the kitchen stair and was conducting a thorough assessment of its lower steps while Agnes Birch, who had taken the child's safety onto her personal responsibility with the seriousness of a professional obligation, counted them down from the doorway. The inn at Carbridge had its lamp above the door. The Fosters sent their quarterly accounts with the specific cleanliness that Rosalind had trained them to, and she checked them every season with the eye of someone who knows what a well-managed establishment looks like, because she built one. Charles set down his correspondence and looked at his wife working by the March light, and the particular stillness of him in that moment, the way he was simply there, watching, having made his decision and held it, was the warmest thing in the room. She knew he was watching. She always knew, and she continued, as she had always continued, with the work in front of her, because she had been keeping things standing for a long time, and she was not going to stop now. Only now, the rooms she was keeping standing were her own,